The plate was already set before Minnie Doyle even sat down. That was the thing that broke her open, right there in the middle of Charles Graves's kitchen, on a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1878, with the smell of venison stew hanging warm and heavy in the air, and the last copper light of the New Mexico sun bleeding through the window above the sink. She had walked in carrying a basket of cornbread she had baked herself, thinking she was doing a neighborly thing, thinking she was simply repaying a kindness, and there it was. A fourth plate set at the long pine table between the two smaller ones that belonged to his children, with a tin cup filled with water and a folded cloth beside it, as neat and deliberate as a declaration. She stopped walking. The basket nearly dropped from her hands. 8-year-old Thomas Graves looked up from where he was ladling stew into his own bowl, and his face did something complicated, something that belonged on a much older face, something that was simultaneously hopeful and terrified and proud all at once. 6-year-old Clara Graves did not look complicated at all. She beamed so wide her missing front tooth showed, and she said perfectly plainly in the voice of someone who had been rehearsing, "We set a place for you, Miss Doyle, because you come most every evening now, and Papa never asks you to stay, and we thought it was time somebody did." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Minnie had ever heard. She set the basket down on the counter. She pressed her hands flat against the rough pine edge to keep them steady. Her throat was doing something she absolutely refused to let get the better of her, not in front of these children, not in front of the door to the bedroom hallway, where she could already hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Charles Graves himself coming to a dead stop somewhere just beyond the frame, having heard every single word his daughter just said. He did not come through that doorway for a long, agonizing moment. And Minnie stood there with her hands braced on the counter and her heart doing something wild and frightened and unnamed in her chest, understanding in a single crystallizing instant that everything she had been telling herself for the past 4 months was a beautiful, comfortable lie. She was not just being neighborly. She had not been just being neighborly for a very long time. And now 2 children had set a plate at their table, and their father was standing frozen on the other side of a wall, and the whole fragile secret world she had built around herself in the town of Redemption, New Mexico, was cracking straight down the middle. Charles Graves appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair shot through with early silver at his temples, though he was only 34 years old. He had a face that had been weathered by years of work and grief in equal measure, a face that was still handsome in the way that hard, honest things are handsome, without any softness to waste. He was holding a dish towel in his hands, and he had clearly been drying a pot when his daughter's voice reached him, because he was still turning the towel over and over between his fingers in the way that a man does when he desperately needs something to hold onto. His eyes met Minnie's across the kitchen. Neither of them said a word. Clara looked between them with the serene patience of a child who has set a very careful trap and is now waiting to see what walks into it. Thomas had gone very still, watching his father with an expression that Minnie now recognized as the particular kind of hope that a boy carries when he has been grieving something for a long time and has finally decided to be brave about it. "Well," Minnie Doyle said at last, because someone had to say something, and she had always been the braver one in any room she had ever entered, even when she was terrified, "I suppose I had better sit down then." And that was how it truly began, not with a grand declaration, not with a carefully planned courtship or a formal introduction or any of the things that a woman was supposed to have in the autumn of 1878 in the New Mexico territory. It began with a plate set by children, and a man in a doorway who could not find his words, and a woman who sat down at a table that already had her name written all over it, even if nobody had said so aloud yet. But to understand what that evening meant, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day Minnie Doyle first arrived in Redemption on the morning stage from Santa Fe, with everything she owned packed into 2 leather satchels and a fierce, quiet determination to start whatever came next. It was April of 1878. The New Mexico Territory was a place of brutal beauty and complicated danger, caught between the dying gasps of the old frontier world and the grinding machinery of a civilization that did not always arrive with kindness. The town of Redemption sat at the edge of a wide valley, backed against the red rock foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Range, with a main street of false-fronted buildings, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse 3 days a week, a general store, a livery, a land office, a saloon called the Dusty Crown, and roughly 300 souls of varying temperament and intention. Minnie Doyle was 26 years old when she stepped off that stage, which made her, by the standards of 1878, a woman who had already missed the conventional window for the kind of life most people expected of her. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of an Irish immigrant father who had built a small but respectable printing business, and a Missouri-born mother who had died of typhoid fever when Minnie was 14. She had worked in her father's print shop all through her adolescence, setting type and running the press and learning the peculiar power of words arranged in careful order on a page. She could read Latin, though she never advertised it. She had opinions about territorial governance that made certain men visibly uncomfortable. She had dark red hair that she kept braided and pinned, dark green eyes, a spray of freckles across her nose that she had long since stopped trying to fade with lemon juice, and a laugh that her father had always said was too loud for a parlor and exactly right for a life. Her father had died that past February. Heart failure, the doctor said, quick and without much suffering, which was the only mercy in it. The printing business had debts she had not known about because her father had been a proud man and a private one. By the time the lawyers were done, there was almost nothing left. The shop was sold. The house was sold. She had spent 2 weeks in the cold St. Louis winter sitting in the rooms of a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Hannigan, who fed her tea and told her, with the particular blunt wisdom of a woman who had outlasted 3 husbands and 4 wars of varying scale, that the worst thing a woman could do in Minnie's situation was wait for the world to offer her something. So she had written letters. She had written to newspapers and land offices and territorial employment agencies. She had a particular skill that was genuinely rare in 1878, not just the ability to read and write, but to typeset, to operate a press, to edit copy, to manage the practical mechanics of a print operation from start to finish. When a letter came back from a man named Horace Webb, who ran the Redemption Courier out of a narrow building on Main Street and who desperately needed someone who actually knew what they were doing, she had read it twice, packed her 2 leather satchels, and bought a stage ticket to Santa Fe with a connecting route south. She had not come to Redemption looking for love. She had been very clear with herself about that. She had come to work. What she had not anticipated in all of her clear-eyed practical planning was Charles Graves. She did not meet him right away. She spent her first 2 weeks in Redemption getting her footing, learning the layout of the courier office, making arrangements for a room at a clean boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Lucinda Farrow, who charged fair rates and asked no intrusive questions, and provided breakfast at 7 and supper at 6 and absolutely no male visitors above the ground floor, which suited Minnie perfectly. Horace Webb turned out to be a round, cheerful man of about 50 who was genuinely delighted to have her, handed over the operational responsibilities of the paper within 3 days with an audible sigh of relief, and spent most of his time thereafter writing editorials about water rights and conducting interviews at the Dusty Crown that lasted considerably longer than they needed to. She met Charles Graves on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of April, when he came into the courier office to place a notice. He wanted to advertise for a part-time hired hand, someone to help on the ranch during the spring and summer months, as his permanent man had left to follow a mining claim near Silver City. He was civil, direct, and clearly not interested in conversation beyond the transaction at hand. He paid for the notice in exact coin, counted out carefully onto the counter. He thanked her without quite meeting her eyes. He was out the door in under 4 minutes. Minnie looked at the notice he had written out in a firm, careful hand, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write properly, and who had not practiced it frequently enough to make it fluid. And she thought, entirely against her will, that he had the most interesting face she had ever seen on a man who clearly had no interest in being interesting. She set his notice in type and thought nothing more about it. Or she told herself that. The gossip about Charles Graves came to her in pieces over the following weeks, delivered primarily by Mrs. Farrow over breakfast, supplemented by various contributors who came into the courier office with notices and subscriptions and occasional letters to the editor. The broad strokes were these. He had come to Redemption 6 years ago from somewhere in eastern Texas, with a wife named Alina and a baby son and land claims, and the kind of focused, quiet energy of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through. He had built the ranch himself with 2 hired men and his own hands. He had been, by all accounts, a good husband and a reliable neighbor, and a man of very few unnecessary words. Alina Graves had died 3 years ago. The baby son, Thomas, had been 5. Clara had been 3. The cause, everyone agreed, had been childbed fever, following a pregnancy that had ended badly in the 7th month. Charles had buried his wife on the hill behind the ranch house, planted a cottonwood tree at the head of the grave, and then continued working his land with the particular kind of ferocious, silent grief that some men carry like a second skeleton. He had not remarried. He had not courted anyone. He had raised his 2 children with a seriousness and a tenderness that the town found admirable and slightly heartbreaking in equal measure, because you could see, if you watched carefully, that he was doing it with the careful, deliberate effort of a man who had to think about how to be warm, who had to consciously work against the instinct to simply bury everything that hurt under work and silence. Several women in Redemption had, over the 3 years since Alina's death, made their interest known in various degrees of subtlety. Charles had been unfailingly polite and absolutely impenetrable. The general consensus, delivered to Minnie by Mrs. Farrow over scrambled eggs on a Friday morning, was that Charles Graves had decided that whatever he had had with Alina was a singular thing that did not get to happen twice, and that he was simply going to carry that loss quietly for the rest of his life. Which is very romantic in a novel, Mrs. Farrow said, refilling Minnie's coffee cup from the enameled pot, and very sad in actual practice. Minnie had said, sincerely, that she had not come to Redemption for romance anyway, and Mrs. Farrow had given her the kind of look that older women give to younger ones when they are being patient. The second time Minnie encountered Charles Graves was in late May, and it was not a transaction. It was an accident, and it involved a runaway horse, a crate of newsprint, and a Tuesday that had already been going badly before it got worse. She had been transporting a delivery of newsprint from the freight depot to the courier office, using the office's small 2-wheeled cart, when the horse borrowed from the livery for this purpose decided that a loose piece of tarpaulin blowing across the street was in fact a credible threat to its existence and shied violently sideways. The cart tipped. The crate of newsprint hit the ground with a crash that brought 3 people to the boardwalk to stare. The horse, now technically free, trotted off down Main Street with the pleased energy of an animal who has accomplished something. Minnie stood in the dust of the street with her braid half undone, her apron filthy, and a crate of expensive newsprint split open at her feet, and she said 3 words that she had learned from the typesetters in her father's print shop that were not appropriate for mixed company. "Anything broken," said a voice behind her. She turned. Charles Graves was crossing from the direction of the general store, having apparently witnessed the entirety of the spectacle. He had a paper-wrapped parcel tucked under one arm and the expression of a man who was very carefully not smiling. "Only my dignity," she said, which was the honest answer. He looked at the crate, then at the scattered newsprint, then at the horse, who had stopped halfway down the street to investigate something on the ground. He set his parcel on the boardwalk, went and caught the horse, led it back, helped her right the cart, and spent the next 15 minutes helping her repack the newsprint in silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence that first made her pay attention. Most men in her experience filled a silence like that with reassurances or advice or stories about worse mishaps they had personally survived. Charles simply worked alongside her without making it a performance, and when they were done he said, "Looks like most of it will be fine." And that was accurate and genuinely useful information. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. He nodded, picked up his parcel from the boardwalk and walked back in the direction of the general store. Then he stopped, turned slightly, and said without quite facing her, "The horse is named Caesar. He does that with tarps. I would have warned you, but I didn't know you'd borrowed him." "I'll remember that," she said. He nodded again and walked away. She stood in the street for a moment looking after him and thought, with a clarity that alarmed her, that this was a man worth knowing. Not in the way that Mrs. Farrow seemed to be hinting, simply as a person, as someone who was genuinely decent in a way that was not performed. The friendship, if you could call it that, built slowly through the summer, not through any design on either side, or at least nothing that either of them admitted to. It was the natural architecture of a small town, where people encountered each other repeatedly, and the encounters accumulated into something that began to have weight. He came into the courier office occasionally. She sometimes needed information for a piece she was writing, and he was, it turned out, one of the most reliably accurate sources on the practical matters of ranching and land and water rights that she had ever encountered. He knew things, real things, and he said them plainly, and did not need to be managed. She met the children for the first time in June, when Charles brought them with him to the office one morning. Thomas was grave and watchful, with his father's eyes, and his father's careful way of taking in a room before committing to anything. Clara was entirely unlike her father in every visible way, bright and immediate and interested in everything, who had apparently decided within 30 seconds of meeting Minnie that she was someone worth knowing. "Can I see the press?" Clara asked. "If your father says you may," Minnie said. Charles looked at his daughter with an expression of resigned affection and said, "Stay where Miss Doyle tells you to stay." Minnie showed Clara how the type was set, guiding her small hands over the raised metal letters, letting her feel how the pieces locked together, explaining what each part did in terms a 6-year-old could follow. Thomas drifted closer without quite admitting he was interested, which Minnie found endearing. She showed him too, talking to him as she would have talked to the apprentices in her father's shop, matter-of-factly and without condescension, and something in the boy's careful face shifted slightly open. Charles watched from the doorway. When she looked up and caught his eye, he looked away, but not quickly enough to hide whatever was in his expression. And whatever it was, it made her breath catch in a way that she firmly elected to ignore. It was Thomas who changed things in the way that children so often do, by seeing things that adults are too careful to see, or too frightened to acknowledge. By August, Minnie had developed the habit of walking out to the Graves Ranch on Thursday afternoons, initially because she needed Charles's view on a piece she was writing about water rights disputes in the valley, and then because Thomas had begun, tentatively and with great deliberation, to share with her the fact that he was struggling with his reading lessons at the schoolhouse. She had offered, carefully and without making it seem large, to help him practice. Charles had looked at her for a long moment when she suggested it, and then said, in his careful way, "That would be good of you if it's not too much." So Thursday afternoons became reading lessons for Thomas, with Clara invariably inserting herself into the proceedings in a supporting role, and occasionally she stayed for supper because the supper was ready, and it seemed strange to leave, and gradually Thursday bled into other days when there was a reason to stop by, which there always seemed to be. She was not falling in love. She was being a good neighbor and a useful member of the community and a helpful tutor to a child who needed it. She held this understanding of herself very firmly all through August and most of September. The evening in late September that began to crack that understanding open was not a dramatic one. It was a Thursday, after a reading lesson, and Thomas had just successfully worked his way through a long passage from a book of natural history that he had chosen himself because it had pictures of horses. Clara had fallen asleep on the settle with a corn-husk doll in her arms. Charles was at the worktable across the room, doing something with a length of harness leather and an awl, and the evening had gone quiet in the way that evenings go quiet when everyone in the room is comfortable, when the silence does not require filling. Minnie looked up from the book Thomas had just finished and found herself thinking that this was what a home felt like. Not the boarding house, not the print shop, not anywhere she had been in the long, scrabbling years since her mother died. This room, this particular configuration of people, the lamplight and the smell of leather, and the sound of a child breathing in sleep. The thought arrived with such force and clarity that it frightened her. She looked down at the book. She said to Thomas in a perfectly ordinary voice that he had done very well and should be proud of himself. Thomas, who had the emotional radar of a child who had been paying very close attention to the adults in his life for a very long time, looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "Do you like it here, Miss Doyle?" "Yes," she said before she could stop herself. "I do." He considered this. "We like you here too," he said, with the simple directness of a statement of documented fact. She did not look at Charles. She was very careful not to look at Charles. But she felt him stop working, and the pause was brief but absolute, and then the all started again, and she thought that if she was not very careful indeed, she was going to be in serious trouble. The dark past arrived in October, which was when everything became complicated in the way that things in the New Mexico Territory in 1878 frequently did, which was suddenly and with very little warning. His name was Dale Forrest, and he came to Redemption on the morning stage from Las Cruces on an unremarkable Monday, carrying a good suit of clothes and a set of documents, and he went directly to the land office. And the thing he did there set a chain of events in motion that would not resolve itself without cost. What Dale Forrest had was a set of backdated land claims, of questionable legitimacy, that appeared on their surface to supersede part of the original title to the Graves Ranch. Whether they were outright forgeries or simply the product of the particular creative lawyering that flourished in territorial land disputes in this era, was something that the lawyers would eventually argue over at some length. What mattered immediately was that Forrest filed them, and the land office had no choice but to process them. And by Wednesday of that week, Charles Graves received a formal notice that a portion of his grazing land and, critically, the water access from the creek that fed it, was under active dispute. Minnie found out about it the way she found out about most things in Redemption, which was through the courier, because Horace Webb wrote a brief notice about the filing, and she was the one who said it in type, and she recognized the name of the ranch immediately and felt something cold and alarmed move through her before she had consciously processed why. She went to see Charles that same evening, which was not a Thursday. This deviation from the established pattern of their arrangement was itself a signal, though she did not frame it to herself that way. She told herself she was going because this was news that affected a member of the community, and it was her job to make sure the reporting was accurate and fair. He was in the yard when she arrived, working on the fence line by the gate with the focused, slightly excessive energy of a man who was angry about something, and had decided that physical labor was the appropriate response. He looked up when he heard her horse on the road, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but was somewhere in that territory. She dismounted and told him directly what was in the filing, what she had read, what it appeared to mean for the water rights specifically. She did not soften it. She had learned very quickly that he preferred the unedited version of things. He listened without interrupting. His hands on the fence post were very still. "Forrest," he said when she finished. "You know him." A pause. It was the first time she had ever seen him hesitate over whether to tell her something, and the hesitation itself told her something important, that there was a history here, that this was not a random event. "I knew a Dale forest in eastern Texas," he said at last. "When I was buying land there years ago before we came here, there was a dispute. I was in the right of it legally, and the county judge agreed, and Forrest lost the claim. I thought that was the end of it." "He followed you here," she said, not a question. "It looks like it." He said it in the flat voice of a man absorbing a blow that he had not seen coming, but that, in hindsight, perhaps he should have. This was a dark past arriving, unannouncedly, as dark pasts do, carrying its old injuries into a present that had been very carefully constructed without them. The hidden motive behind the land claim filing was not profit, or not primarily. It was something colder than that. It was the particular vindictiveness of a man who had lost something once, and had spent years constructing a mechanism for revenge that was legal enough to be impossible to simply refuse. "I'll write about it in the Courier," Minnie said, "fairly and accurately, which means reporting that the claims are disputed and that the original title has been held for 6 years without challenge. That's not editorializing, it's fact. It matters." He looked at her. In the fading light of the October evening, with his dark hair falling forward slightly and the lines of his face carrying all the weight of the past 3 years and the past 10 minutes, he looked like a man who was unused to people offering to stand beside him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly ordinary, and then he looked away, back at the fence, and said, quietly, "Thank you, Minnie." It was the first time he had used her given name. She was almost certain he did not realize he had done it. She walked back to her horse and rode back to Redemption and sat in her room at Mrs. Farrow's boarding house for a long time, not reading, not writing, just sitting with the knowledge that she was, despite every careful and rational decision she had made about her life in this town, already lost. The situation with Forrest developed through October in the grinding, slow way of legal disputes, which is to say that it created a constant, low-level anxiety that was almost worse than a crisis that could be directly addressed. He had hired a lawyer from Santa Fe, a sharp, quiet man named Aldous Price, who knew exactly which procedural mechanisms to use to keep the dispute alive as long as possible. Charles had retained a local attorney, a capable man named Samuel Bright, who was doing everything right but who was honest enough to admit that the process was going to take time. During this period, Minnie wrote 3 pieces for the Courier about land title disputes in the territory, none of them specifically about Charles's case, but all of them illuminating the broader context of how the system worked and how it could be manipulated. Horace Webb read them, said they were the best writing the paper had published in 5 years, and ran all 3 on the front page. 2 of them were reprinted in the Santa Fe New Mexican. She also, without making any formal announcement of this fact, started doing something else. Her father's print shop in St. Louis had maintained a network of contacts across the Midwest and Southwest, other printers, newspaper editors, legal notice publishers, and she knew how to use those contacts to locate records. She began, on her own time, tracing the history of Dale Forest's land dealings, going back through the available public records, writing letters to county clerks in Texas. What she found, after 3 weeks of careful work, was not one dispute but a pattern. Forrest had done this before, not in exactly the same way, but the shape of it was recognizable. The studied targeting of men who had previously crossed him in legitimate legal proceedings, the manufactured claims, the deliberate procedural delay, the eventual settlement that gave him something even if he could not take everything. She compiled what she found into a detailed document, cross-referenced and sourced, and she gave it to Samuel Bright, and she said calmly that she thought this constituted evidence of a hidden motive and a pattern of harassment that was relevant to the legal proceedings. Samuel Bright read it twice and said, with genuine respect, that this was excellent investigative work and could be genuinely material to the case. She did not tell Charles that she had done this. She told herself it was because she did not want to raise his hopes before she knew if it would matter. The truer reason, which she admitted to herself only reluctantly, was that she was not certain how to explain why she had spent her personal time and used her private connections on his behalf without saying something that she was not ready to say. The document became part of the legal proceedings. Aldous Price, Forrest's attorney, did not seem to have anticipated that anyone in Redemption would have the resources or the knowledge to do what Minnie had done, which told you something about how he had assessed the situation and how wrong he had been. The case, which had seemed likely to drag into the following spring, began to shift in November. But that was still a month away, and November was when everything else happened. Thomas Graves figured out, in the particular way that perceptive children figure out emotional truths that adults are still actively denying to themselves, that something was going on between his father and Miss Doyle that his father was not acknowledging. He had been watching this unfold all summer with the patience of a naturalist observing something in its natural habitat. And by October, he had reached certain conclusions that he began to share with his sister in the private, serious consultations that siblings conduct. Clara, who processed the world through feeling rather than observation, had arrived at the same conclusions by a different route, which was that she simply felt happier when Miss Doyle was in the house, and she felt the particular quality of her father's quiet change when Miss Doyle was in the room, a change that she had no words for at 6 years old, but that she recognized with the accuracy of a child's emotional intuition as something important. What they decided to do about this, as the evenings grew shorter and the air coming off the mountains turned sharp and cold, was their own affair. They planned it in the barn, which was their habitual planning location, Thomas drawing diagrams in the dust with a stick while Clara made suggestions and refuted options with the creative energy of a small person who had strong opinions and no patience for unnecessary complication. The plan was simpler than its architects. Set a place at the table. See what happened. They had chosen the Tuesday in early November because it was a day when Minnie sometimes stopped by with cornbread, which she had started doing because Charles was particular about his baking, and she had noticed, without appearing to notice, that he and the children were eating a great deal of plain bread and not a great deal else with their suppers. The cornbread was always received with the formal politeness of someone accepting a gift they are very aware of and are trying not to show how much they value. So on that particular Tuesday, they set the table before she arrived, and Thomas served as the one who would actually put the plate down because he was old enough to do it without dropping things, and Clara was the one who would speak first because she was the one who could always be trusted to say what needed to be said without hesitation. And it worked, in the way that plans work when they are built on something true. Minnie sat down at that table. She sat down in the place they had set for her, with her hand still slightly unsteady, and she accepted the bowl of stew that Thomas ladled for her with a ceremony that he was trying very hard to make look casual, and she ate supper at the Graves family table as if she had always belonged there, which was exactly the feeling that the children had been counting on her to feel, because they had been watching her for months, and they knew she felt it. Charles sat across from her. He looked, for the first several minutes of the meal, like a man who has survived something sudden and is still in the process of determining the extent of the damage. He ate his supper. He answered Clara's account of something that had happened at the schoolhouse that day. He passed the bread without being asked. He was perfectly ordinary in every visible way, and he was, Minnie understood, working very hard to be so, because the alternative to being ordinary was saying something that he was not certain he knew how to say. After supper, the children were sent to wash up and get ready for bed. This was normal. What was not normal was that Charles did not find a reason to be busy in another part of the house. He sat at the table with his coffee cup, and Minnie sat at the table with hers, and there was a silence between them that was not comfortable in the way their silences usually were. This one had something in it. Something that had been building since April and that two children and a set plate had brought right up to the surface. "They planned that," Charles said at last. He said it to the coffee cup. "I know," Minnie said. "Thomas gets his planning instincts from Alina," he said. She was always the one who saw the whole thing before it started. It was the first time he had said Alina's name to her. She was aware of how carefully he had never said it before. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Minnie said, and she meant it without any reservation, because a woman who raised a son like Thomas and loved a man who still carried her that way 3 years later was absolutely remarkable, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. Charles looked up from his coffee cup and met her eyes, and she saw something happen in his face, something like the slow easing of a thing that had been held very tight for a very long time. "She was," he said. "She was the bravest person I ever knew." He paused. "Until fairly recently." The way he said it, low and direct and looking straight at her, made the words land with the weight of a thing said deliberately. "Charles," she said. "I know," he said. "I know I should have said something. I have known for months that I should say something and I could not." He set the coffee cup down and pressed both hands flat on the table, which was a gesture she recognized as his version of bracing himself. "I do not know how to do this. I should be honest with you about that. Alina and I, we were very young when we met, and it was simple in the way that things are simple when you are young and you have not yet had to think carefully about what you want. This is not simple, and I have been afraid of it, which I am not proud of." "You are afraid that caring about someone again means you are betraying her," Minnie said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes. You are wrong," she said, gently and firmly, in the voice she used when she was stating something that was factually true and required no argument. "Loving someone well and then carrying them with you when they are gone is not a betrayal of them. And the children need someone to set a place at the table, Charles, even when their father is afraid to ask." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the November wind moved across the valley, and somewhere in the back of the house, a small voice said something indistinct and sleepy that was probably Clara asking Thomas something, and the ordinary domestic life of the house went on around them, as if it had always included her, as if this too was simply the way things were. "Would you allow me to call on you properly?" he said at last. "I understand if that is not something you want. You came here for your own reasons and your own life, and I have no expectation." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again, more quietly. "I would like that very much." The expression that crossed his face was not a dramatic one. It was not theatrical. It was something quiet and enormous, like a door opening in a room that has been shut for a very long time, letting in air and light and the possibility of warmth. The formal courtship that followed was, by the conventions of redemption in 1878, appropriate and measured. He came to the boarding house on Friday evenings and walked with her to the hotel dining room, which was the only establishment in Redemption that served supper with anything approaching formal pretension, and they sat across from each other and talked for hours in a way that had always been natural between them, but that now had the additional charge of being openly acknowledged. They talked about everything. They talked about his years in Texas, and the early years of the ranch, and the grief of Alina's death in the blunt, clear way that he was apparently capable of talking about it now that he had started. They talked about her father and the print shop and St. Louis in winter, and the particular loneliness of being a capable woman in a world that frequently wished you would be less capable. They talked about the children in the way that two people talk about children when the children are a shared concern, discussing Thomas's reading progress with a mutual pride that neither of them made explicit, laughing over something Clara had said that week that was funny and slightly alarming in the philosophical scope it revealed in a 6-year-old. They talked about the land dispute, which was moving toward resolution. The document Minnie had prepared had proven, as Samuel Bright had hoped, genuinely material. The pattern of behavior she had documented gave the territorial judge grounds to view Forrest's claims with significantly heightened scrutiny, and an initial ruling in late November determined that the claims as filed were insufficiently documented to override a 6-year held title in good standing. Forrest's attorney filed an appeal, but it was understood by everyone involved, including Forrest himself, that this was a delay rather than a genuine challenge. The water rights remained with the Graves Ranch. On the evening that Samuel Bright brought this news, Charles told her over supper, not at the hotel but at his kitchen table, where she had begun to come most evenings again, which was where things felt real, and his hands had shaken very slightly when he told her, which was the first time she had seen him physically affected by emotion, and she had reached across the table without thinking and put her hand over his, and his hand had turned under hers and held on. He held on for a long time before either of them said anything else. It was Clara who, in mid-December, with the directness that characterized everything she did, said to Minnie while Minnie was braiding her hair before the schoolhouse, "Are you going to marry Papa?" Thomas, from across the room where he was lacing up his boots, went very still in exactly the way that people go still when they want very badly to hear the answer to a question, but are pretending they are not listening. Minnie finished the braid before she answered, tying it off with the blue ribbon that Clara had chosen. "I think," she said carefully, "that your papa and I are still getting to know each other properly. But do you want to?" Clara pressed, turning around to look at her with absolute directness. "Clara," Thomas said, in the warning tone of an older sibling. "It is a fair question," Clara said without looking at him. Minnie looked at this small, fierce girl with her bright eyes and her direct manner and the blue ribbon in her hair, and she thought about all the careful language she had been using with herself for months, all the rational, measured ways she had been describing what she felt about this family and this kitchen and this man, and she thought that Clara was absolutely right. It was a fair question, and fair questions deserved honest answers. "Yes," she said, "I do want to." Clara turned back to Thomas with an expression of complete vindication. Thomas, who was not able to entirely suppress the thing that happened to his face at this answer, looked very hard at his bootlace. "Good," Clara said, in the tone of someone ticking an item off a mental list. Charles proposed to Minnie Doyle on a cold Saturday morning in January of 1879, on the hill behind the ranch house, near the cottonwood tree above Eleanor's grave. He had chosen the place deliberately, and she understood why when she saw it, and she loved him for it. He had told her where he was going to take her before they walked up the hill. He had told her that he wanted Eleanor to be part of this moment, not as an obstacle or a shadow over something new, but as a presence acknowledged, because she had loved him and he had loved her, and the children who stood at the foot of that hill were her children too, and starting a new life without that acknowledgement would feel dishonest. Minnie had listened to him say this, and felt something in her chest that was not jealousy and not grief, but something closer to the kind of love that includes all the complicated, layered truth of who a person is. They stood at the grave in the cold January morning, with the valley spread out below them and the mountains white with early snow above, and Charles took both her hands in his and said, without any preamble, because he had never been a man for preamble, "I love you, Minnie. I did not expect it and I was afraid of it for a long time and I am done being afraid of it. Will you marry me and stay here with us? With all of us?" She said yes. She said it without hesitation, without condition, without any of the careful language she had been using to protect herself for months, and the word came out with a clarity that surprised her with its own certainty, as if it had been waiting in her for a long time to be the right answer to the right question. He kissed her for the first time there, on that cold hillside, briefly and honestly, with the kind of kiss that is not performance but is simply true, and she held onto his coat lapels and thought that this was the exact right beginning of everything. They were married in April of 1879, Exactly 1 year after Minnie had stepped off the morning stage from Santa Fe with her 2 leather satchels and her fierce, practical intention to start whatever came next. The wedding was held in the church that doubled as the schoolhouse, which seemed fitting. Horace Webb cried, which no one had anticipated. Mrs. Farrow wore her good dress and looked satisfied in the way of someone whose predictions have been thoroughly vindicated. Samuel Bright attended with his wife and shook Charles's hand for a long time. Thomas stood at his father's side through the ceremony with the composed dignity of a boy who had been waiting for this for a long time and was determined to do it properly. Clara was her bridesmaid, a role she had accepted with such intense seriousness that she had spent 2 weeks practicing walking at the correct pace, and she walked Minnie down the aisle of the little church with her small hand in Minnie's, and her face set with the gravity of someone performing an important official function. The ring was a simple gold band that Charles had ordered from Santa Fe 2 months before he proposed, because even when he was afraid to say the words he had been quietly, practically preparing for the moment. Minnie learned this afterward, and it made her love him in a way that was specifically about this, about the way he prepared for things he wanted while his courage was still catching up. They moved Minnie's things to the ranch house over the course of a week. The room that became her workspace was a sunny one at the front of the house, and she set up a small correspondence desk there, because she had negotiated with Horace Webb an arrangement that let her continue working for the Courier on an editorial basis, while also running the practical life of the ranch household, which was the compromise of a capable woman who had not come to the frontier to stop being herself. Charles watched her arrange her books and papers in the new room with an expression that she had learned to read by now, the quiet, full expression that meant he was feeling something significant and was choosing to show it simply by being present rather than putting it into words. She looked up from the desk and found him in the doorway and said, "Come in, it is your house." "It is our house," he said, with the simple, corrective insistence of someone stating a foundational fact. The summer of 1879 was the best summer of Minnie's life up to that point, and she was honest enough with herself to say so. The ranch was a working operation with all the demands and difficulties that entailed, and she was not pretending otherwise, but it was her work too now, and she was not a woman who had ever been frightened of work. She learned the rhythms of the land and the seasons, and the specific personalities of the cattle, and the horses with the same systematic attention she had always brought to anything she wanted to understand. She and Charles worked well together in the practical way that is its own form of love, the kind that shows up in how you divide a task without having to discuss it, in how you can read each other's intentions across a distance without speaking, in the particular satisfaction of two people who have found their complementary edges. Thomas's reading had come so far by summer that he was working through books 3 years above his grade level, and the pride his father took in this was a quiet, enormous thing. Clara, meanwhile, had developed opinions about the ranch's chickens that were both practical and philosophical, and occupied a great deal of her conversational energy, and the evenings in the Graves household were, more often than not, filled with the particular warm noise of a family that was complete in itself, that did not need anything else to be what it was, except that something else was coming. Minnie told Charles in August of 1879, on a warm evening when the valley was golden with the last of the summer light and the children were asleep, and he had held very still for a long moment in the way he did when he was absorbing something large, and then he had put his arms around her and held her in a way that said everything that he did not quite have words for immediately. "Are you glad?" she asked, because she needed to hear it, because this was the kind of moment when you needed the actual words. "Minnie," he said into her hair, "I am more glad than I know how to tell you. I am going to work on finding the words." She laughed, and he held her tighter, and the summer evening went on around them, warm and certain. The final confrontation with Dale Forrest came in September, which was the resolution of the trap that Forrest had been setting for years, and which resolved itself not through violence but through the grinding machinery of territorial law, assisted by the extensive documentation that Minnie had assembled and that Samuel Bright had weaponized so effectively. The appeal was dismissed. The land office issued a final determination restoring full, unchallenged title to every portion of the Graves ranch. Forrest left redemption the same week the ruling came down, and the consensus of the town was that he would not be back. Charles read the formal determination when Samuel Bright delivered it. He folded it very carefully and put it in the fireproof metal box where he kept the original land deeds, and then he went outside and stood on the porch in the September morning for a long, quiet minute, and Minnie stood beside him and did not say anything because sometimes nothing needed to be said. "It's over," he said at last. "It is," she said. He reached out without looking at her and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and the valley spread out before them in the early autumn light, free and secure, and entirely their own. The baby arrived in March of 1880. He was born on a Thursday morning, which Clara declared was meaningful because Thursdays were when Miss Doyle had first come for reading lessons and good things happened on Thursdays. And the doctor, a practical man named Henderson who drove out from Redemption, declared both mother and child perfectly healthy, which was the thing Charles needed to hear most urgently, and which he received with a physical relief so intense that Thomas quietly went to stand next to his father and put his hand in the older man's without saying anything, which was perhaps the most Thomas thing Thomas had ever done. They named him Robert Doyle Graves, which was Minnie's father's name. She had asked Charles about this, tentatively, not certain how he would feel about the name, and he had said immediately that it was right and he was glad she wanted it. And the simplicity and completeness of his response was, as so many of his responses were, exactly what she needed. Robert Doyle Graves arrived into a house that was ready for him. Thomas, now 10 years old and very serious about his new responsibilities as the eldest, had arranged his room to accommodate what he understood to be the spatial requirements of a small person, based on extensive prior observation of his sister. Clara, 8 years old and absolutely definitive in her opinions, had already determined that her brother was going to be interested in the chickens when he got old enough, because everyone should be interested in the chickens, and she was prepared to provide a comprehensive education when the time came. Minnie lay in the big bed in the bedroom that was now unmistakably theirs, with the new baby in the crook of her arm and the spring light coming through the window, and Charles came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression that fathers have when they are looking at something that has made the world irrevocably larger. "He has your hair," he said. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "I could already tell from the delivery." He laughed, which was still one of her favorite sounds in the world, all the more valuable for being less rare now than it had been when she first met him. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, which was starfish small and perfect, and the baby's fingers closed automatically around his father's index finger in the grip reflex that newborns have, and the expression on Charles's face at this was something Minnie would remember for the rest of her life. "Are you all right?" he asked her. He asked it seriously, with full attention, which was how he asked everything that mattered. "I am better than all right," she said honestly. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, and she closed her eyes, and the March morning went on quietly around them, and somewhere in the front of the house she could hear Thomas and Clara having a murmured argument about something that did not sound urgent, and the fire in the hearth was warm, and everything was exactly as it should be. The 2 years that followed were good years, built in the way that good years are built, through the accumulation of ordinary days that have meaning in them. The ranch grew steadily under Charles's management and Minnie's organizational intelligence, which turned out to be a formidable combination. They hired a permanent hand named Jorge, a capable, good-natured man from a family that had ranched the valley for 2 generations before the territory changed hands, and he fit into the working life of the place naturally, and became, over time, genuinely fond of the family. Minnie continued her work with the Courier on a part-time basis. Her pieces on territorial governance, water rights, and land law became genuinely influential in local politics, cited in other papers, and occasionally in Santa Fe in ways that made Horace Webb so proud he could barely contain himself. She was careful not to let the work consume the life. She was also honest with herself that the work was part of the life, that it was part of who she was, and Charles had always known this and had never, not once, suggested that it should be otherwise. Thomas, in the spring of 1881, when he was 12, had a conversation with his father that both of them later described to Minnie separately, without coordinating what they said, and the fact that their accounts matched in every detail told her something important about both of them. Thomas had said, directly and without build-up, that he was glad his father had not stayed sad forever, that it had been hard when they were all sad, and that he thought his mother would have wanted his father to find someone good. Charles had apparently been silent for a long time after this. Then he had told Thomas that he thought so too, and that the specific person who had been found was irreplaceable, and that he hoped Thomas knew that she was his in every way that mattered, not a replacement for anything but an addition, a new thing which was different from substitution. Thomas had said he knew that already. And then he had gone back to whatever he had been doing before the conversation, because that was Thomas. Clara, at 9, had asked Minnie whether it was all right to call her Mama. She had asked it in the direct way she asked everything, sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with her braids coming undone and a piece of cornbread in her hand, looking at Minnie with those bright eyes that missed nothing. Minnie had said yes. She had said it without hesitating, without qualifying, without making it complicated. She had said that she would be honored. Clara had nodded, eaten her cornbread, and jumped off the bench, and 2 minutes later could be heard outside telling the chickens about this development, which was apparently the announcement method she preferred. Charles, who had been in the next room and had heard all of it, appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that Minnie had stopped trying to find words for. She looked at him across the kitchen, across the distance of a room that had once had a place set at its table before anyone found the courage to ask for it, and she thought that this was what a life was. Not one dramatic moment, but the sum of all the ordinary ones, each one weighted with the specific truth of the people living it. "I heard," he said. "I know," she said. He came across the kitchen and kissed her in the morning light, unhurried and completely, and baby Robert's voice rose from the back room in the escalating preliminary announcement of waking up, which they had both learned to interpret as a countdown to urgent action, and Clara's voice from outside told the chickens something additional, and Thomas's boots could be heard on the porch, and the morning opened around them in all its ordinary, irreplaceable fullness. In the autumn of 1882, when Robert was 2 years old and Clara was 10 and Thomas was 12, and the ranch was 4 years into being the home that Minnie had quietly built it into alongside everything Charles had already made it, Minnie discovered she was expecting again. She told Charles in the evening, sitting on the porch in the cool September air, with the valley dark and the stars beginning to come out above the mountains. He received the news with the same quality of held stillness that she now recognized as his particular form of joy. The way his happiness went inward and quiet rather than outward and demonstrative, which was simply the way he was, which she had loved for years. "Robert will be glad to have company," he said. "He will terrorize them mercilessly," she said. "He already terrorizes the dog." "He does," Charles agreed, with the fond resignation of a father who knows his child's character entirely. She rested her head on his shoulder in the dark, and his arm came around her, and they sat like that for a while, watching the valley, saying nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. The second baby was a girl. She arrived in May of 1883, loud and determined and red in the face, which the doctor said was perfectly normal, and which Clara said meant she had Minnie's personality, which was intended as a compliment and received as one. They named her Eleanor Grace Graves. Charles had been the one to suggest a leaner, quietly and with great care, checking Minnie's face as he said it, making sure it was a gift and not a wound. It was a gift. It was the kind of thing that only a man who understood love in all its complicated, inclusive depth would think to offer. Eleanor Grace Graves grew up with a brother who was 3 years old when she was born and who regarded her, from the beginning, with the odd seriousness of someone confronted with something he did not fully understand but was determined to protect. Robert's relationship with his sister was a lifelong feature of family dinners and letters and stories told at holidays. The peculiar ferocity of a little boy who had become a girl's first champion before he was old enough to articulate why. Thomas and Clara, at 12 and 10, were old enough to be genuinely useful in the practical running of the household during the weeks following Eleanor's birth, and they stepped into this without being asked, with a competence that made Minnie think about the people they were becoming. Thomas was going to be a lawyer or a scientist or something that required the exact kind of methodical, precise intelligence he had been building since before he could read properly. Clara was going to be whatever she decided she was going to be, and whatever it was, she was going to do it with absolute conviction. She told Charles this one evening, lying in the lamplight after the children were asleep, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thomas reminds me of Eleanor sometimes. The way he sees the whole room before he commits to anything, she had that." "And Clara?" she asked. "Clara is her own thing entirely," he said, and the love in how he said it was total and uncomplicated. "Eleanor Grace is going to be trouble," Minnie said. "She is absolutely going to be trouble," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice in the dark. The Courier published a piece in the spring of 1884 that Minnie wrote over several weeks, the most ambitious piece she had ever produced, a long examination of how territorial land law had been used across the New Mexico Territory to systematically disadvantage certain communities, including long-established Hispanic ranching families like Jorge's, who had held land under Spanish, and then Mexican law that the American territorial system had not always honored. She sourced it carefully, named names where the records supported naming them, and did not soften the conclusions. It caused a considerable stir. 2 politicians in Santa Fe wrote letters to the paper, one threatening and one embarrassed. Horace Webb ran it anyway, with a front-page editorial of his own that was the most pointed thing he had written in years. Several people in Redemption were angry about it. Several more were grateful in ways they expressed quietly and privately, including Jorge, who came to the ranch on a Sunday morning and stood in the yard talking to Minnie for 20 minutes, and then shook her hand in a way that said more than the conversation had. Charles had read the piece 3 times when she brought home the print edition. He had said, without qualification, that it was the most important thing ever published in the Redemption Courier, and probably one of the most important things published in the territory. He had also said that she should expect unpleasantness, and that he was going to be right beside her for all of it. There was unpleasantness. It passed, as unpleasantness usually does when the ground under you is solid. She published 2 more pieces in the series over the following months, and they built a record that eventually found its way into a territorial legislative debate on land title reform that had some real, if partial, effect. It was not everything. It was something. By the time summer came in 1884, the Graves Ranch was thriving. The family was whole and full, and the kind of loving that is not performance but is simply the air of a particular place. And Minnie Doyle Graves, who had come to Redemption with 2 leather satchels and no intention of falling in love, was 32 years old and more entirely herself than she had ever been in her life. She and Charles walked the property on Sunday mornings when they could, an old habit that had started in the early days of their marriage when they both needed the space to talk without the noise of the household. On a particular Sunday in July of 1884, they walked up the hill to the cottonwood tree, as they sometimes did, and stood in the summer morning looking out at the valley, at the land that was theirs and their children's after them. "I want to tell you something," Charles said. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley, gathering it the way he gathered things that mattered, with care and without hurry. "When I was in that kitchen doorway," he said, "the evening they set the place at the table, I heard Clara say it, and I stopped walking. And what I felt was the most frightening thing I had ever felt in my adult life, which was that it was true. That the place had been set and you had sat down and it was already true, and I had been so afraid for so long that I had almost missed it. That I had almost let the fear of losing something again prevent me from having something real." And I thought he stopped, because the thing he was trying to say was not easy to say. "What did you think?" she said quietly. "I thought that Alina would be furious with me," he said, and there was a roughness in his voice that he did not try to hide. "For waiting so long, for being so afraid. She was never afraid of real things. And I thought, if you leave this kitchen right now and say no, you will deserve everything you are left with." Minnie was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of this, feeling how much it cost him to say it. "You did not leave the kitchen," she said. "I did not leave the kitchen," he agreed. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, turning his face toward her so he was looking at her directly, so he could see what she was about to say clearly. "I would not have left either," she said. "I was already lost, Charles. From the moment you told me about the horse's name. I just wasn't honest about it yet." He laughed, and the roughness in it broke into something lighter, and she felt his arms come around her, and she let herself be held in the way that you can only let yourself be held by someone you trust completely, without reservation, without the careful management of what you are allowing them to see. Below them, the sound of children drifted up from the ranch house yard. Clara's voice, carrying, explaining something at length to someone who was probably Robert. Thomas's steadier voice somewhere further off. And underneath it, just barely audible, the higher, newer voice of a leaner Grace, who at just over a year old had discovered that she could make sounds and was experimenting with their range and application. "We should go back down," Minnie said. "In a minute," he said, and held on a little longer. She let him. She held on too. The November of 1884, which was their 5th autumn on the ranch as a family, brought with it the first frost and the particular quality of light that the late-season sun makes on the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which was so reliably beautiful that it had stopped being ordinary even after years. It brought also the news, delivered by Thomas with the solemn pleasure of someone sharing important intelligence, that he had been offered a place as an apprentice to Samuel Bright's law office, beginning the following January when he turned 15. Charles received this information with a pride so enormous it was almost embarrassing for him. He shook his son's hand, which was the Graves family gesture for things that words could not contain, and Thomas received this with his characteristic composure, and then went out to the barn to spend 20 minutes by himself being privately overwhelmed, in the way that Graves' men were privately overwhelmed when things mattered greatly. Minnie found him there. She did not say much. She sat on the fence rail near where he was brushing one of the horses, and after a few minutes she said, "Your father is very proud of you, you know that." "I know," Thomas said to the horse. "I am very proud of you too," she said. "I want you to know that specifically." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in the direct, careful way that was entirely his, "You made that possible, the reading and all of it. Before you came, I had decided I was not clever. You were always clever," she said. "You needed someone to show you the access." He turned and looked at her with his father's eyes. "I am glad you sat down at the table that night," he said. She felt the thing in her chest that she was now entirely comfortable feeling, that warm, enormous thing that did not have a simple name. "I am glad they set a place," she said. He nodded in the way that Thomas nodded when something was settled, and went back to brushing the horse, and the barn was quiet and warm around them, and outside the mountains caught the last of the afternoon light and held it. In the spring of 1885, the Graves family sat at the long pine kitchen table for supper, which was the ordinary event of an ordinary evening, and also the thing that mattered most. Thomas was 15 now, apprenticing with Samuel Bright 3 mornings a week, and already demonstrating the kind of legal precision that would eventually make him, in later years, one of the more respected attorneys in the territory. Clara was 13 and formidably opinionated about everything from the chickens to the recent territorial elections to the proper way to braid hair, and she was also learning to bake with a seriousness that suggested she was not going to be outdone in any domestic skill that she decided to adopt. Robert was 5 and entirely too confident about everything, in the cheerful, fearless way of a child who has never had reason to doubt his welcome in any room. Eleanor Grace was 2, recently walking, currently conducting an investigation of the world with the systematic energy of someone who finds everything suspicious and interesting in equal measure. Charles sat at the head of the table and looked at his family in the way that he looked at it sometimes, quietly and completely, the full inventory of something he had almost been too afraid to have. Minnie looked up from serving Robert his second helping of the stew that she had learned to make the way he liked it, which was more peppery than she would have chosen herself, and she caught Charles's eye across the table. He did not need to say anything. She did not need to say anything. The conversation that passed between them in that look was the language of 5 years of marriage and 10 years of knowing each other, the particular dialect of two people who have learned to love well and have been given time to practice it. Clara was telling Robert something about the chickens. Thomas was quietly reading a document from Samuel Bright's office that he had brought to the table, which was technically not permitted, and which neither of his parents were currently enforcing. Eleanor Grace was attempting to put her spoon somewhere that it did not belong, and Robert's hand shot out with brotherly authority and redirected it, and Eleanor fixed him with a look of absolute indignation that made Clara laugh. Outside, the spring evening was soft and warm, and the valley was green from the April rains, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains were still capped with snow at their highest points, and the cottonwood tree on the hill above Eleanor's grave was coming into new leaf in the way it did every spring, faithful and steady, and part of the permanent geography of the place. Minnie Doyle had come to redemption with 2 leather satchels and a fierce, practical intention to start whatever came next, and what had come next was this, was all of this, was a life that she could not have designed or planned or predicted in any of the careful, rational ways she had always planned things. It had come to her instead through the side door, through the unexpected grace of children who were braver than their father, through a plate set at a table, and a small voice saying simply that it was time somebody asked. She had stayed because she had been asked, and she had been asked because she had already been wanted, and she had been wanted because she was, in the end, exactly who she was, and who she had been from the very beginning, exactly right for this. Charles reached across the corner of the table and took her hand without ceremony or explanation, in the middle of Clara's account of the chickens and Robert's protest about the Eleanor Grace spoon situation and Thomas's quiet page-turning, and she held his hand back in the same way, without ceremony or explanation, because that was what they were now and had been and would continue to be. The spring evening opened around them. The supper table was full. The lamp burned warm and bright. Nothing was missing. Everything was right where it belonged,